everybody. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. 2 teenage boys, 1 set of railroad tracks, and a mystery that has haunted a small town for over 3 decades. In August of 1987, Don Henry and Kevin Ives were found dead on a set of railroad tracks in Bryant, Arkansas. Initially ruled as an accident, despite plenty of evidence to the contrary, the case quickly spiraled into something much darker. As the investigation unfolded, bizarre clues surfaced, suggesting the boys may have been murdered, their deaths a part of a larger conspiracy that stretched into the highest levels of law enforcement and politics. This case has been requested so many times over the years. I had it on so many lists of cases to eventually cover. Now I completely understand why. The events that happened in this small Arkansas town are not only unbelievable, but infuriating. Even though we have explored so many cases involving corruption and lies from the very people who are tasked with protecting the public, even though we have explored the depths of human depravity together, and I thought that nothing could surprise me, the audacity of some of the people involved in this case has left me stunned. But luckily, not speechless. I have things to say. I have a lot of things to say. So let's dive into this frustrating spiderweb of a case. But first, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Helix Sleep. Sleep is one of the most important things we do every day. But between work and family and whatever else we've got going on, it's likely that both you and I are not getting enough of it. Sleep, that is. But at least on a Helix Sleep mattress, you can be sure the quality of your sleep will be impeccable. Helix Sleep makes premium mattresses customized to fit your needs, and they are conveniently shipped right to your door. To get started, all you have to do is take the Helix Sleep quiz, where you'll answer a few questions about your body type and sleep preferences, such as whether you're a side sleeper, back sleeper, or if you like to sleep on your stomach. And you're also going to answer questions about the mattress itself. Do you like a softer or a firmer mattress? Personally, I like a firmer mattress, but that's just me. Now, the Helix lineup offers 20 unique mattresses, including their award-winning Luxe and Ultra Premium Elite collections. They also offer the Helix Plus, which is a mattress designed for big and tall sleepers, and the Helix Kids mattress, which is designed for growing bodies and endorsed by child sleep and medical experts. So my 7 going on 8-year-old Bella has the Helix Sleep mattress. She absolutely loves it, and I love that it grows with her, so I don't have to buy a new mattress every few years when she shoots up. I've had my Helix Sleep Midnight Luxe mattress for years. I don't know, over 5 years by now. And I remember before I slept on it, I would always wake up every morning feeling exhausted and with body pain and back pain. And I kind of just thought that was a part of life. I was like, you're laying down in one position all night. Maybe you're going to wake up a little sore. But I got to tell you, with my Midnight Luxe mattress, that does not happen. I wake up feeling far more refreshed, even if I get less sleep. And I'm not sore from head to toe. And that's because I'm not tossing and turning in my sleep all night trying to get comfortable, which means I'm getting a better quality of sleep, a more solid block of sleep. Like I said, I prefer a firmer mattress. I sleep on my side, and the difference I've noticed the most is no lower back pain in the morning, because my Helix Sleep mattress cradles and supports me. Now, the mattress is going to arrive to your home with free shipping in the US. It's going to be all rolled up in a box. You just open the box, unroll it. It's super easy to set up. Plus, Helix Sleep, unlike other brands, does not contain fiberglass, because a lot of these other mattress brands use fiberglass as a flame retardant, and as you know, fiberglass can be very harmful to your health. Helix actually owns its own manufacturing facility, which is entirely free from products containing fiberglass. And if it makes you nervous to buy a mattress you haven't physically laid on, don't worry, Helix has you covered. Not only do they have a 100-night sleep trial, so you get more than 3 months to make sure you love your new mattress, but they have a 10-year warranty, and they even offer financing options and flexible payment plans, so a great night's sleep is never far away. I love my Helix Sleep mattress, and I know that if you try it out, you will love yours as well. So if you're looking for a new bed and better sleep, check out Helix Sleep by clicking the link in the description box below or going to helixsleep.com/Harlowe. Helix's end-of-year sale is running now for a limited time, and it's a great time to upgrade your mattress. Visit helixsleep.com/Harlowe to get 25% off your mattress plus 2 free pillows and receive a free bedding bundle with your Luxe or Elite order. Thank you so much to Helix Sleep for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. Bryant, Arkansas is a city located in Saline County, just southwest of Little Rock, the state's capital. Today, about 20,000 people live there, but in the 1980s, Bryant was still a relatively small town with a population of around 6,000 residents. However, like many other small towns in America, Bryant was starting to see a population growth as families moved out of the more urban areas like Little Rock in search of quieter living spaces, more affordable housing, and a slower pace of life. During the 80s, Bryant's economy was mainly based on agriculture, and the town had a few small shops, a local grocery store, and a handful of family-owned businesses that served the surrounding community. In this small, tight-knit town where family values and hard work were passed down from generation to generation, 16-year-old Don Henry and 17-year-old Kevin Ives lived and died. The two boys were both students at Bryant High School, and they had only known each other about 6 months, but they'd become fast and close friends, even though their backgrounds and family lives were a bit different. Kevin lived with his parents, Linda and Larry Ives, and his older sister, Alicia, in a nice suburban home with a pool in the backyard. His mother, Linda, worked for the Alcoa Credit Union, his father, Larry, was an engineer with the Union Pacific Railroad, and the family owned a ski boat that they would take to Lake Washita on the weekends. For a long time, Kevin mainly hung out with the kids his own age who lived in his subdivision, and there was a lot of them, including a kid named Mike, who lived 3 streets away and who'd been Kevin's best friend since the boys were small. Recently, however, the two had fought over a girl. Mike had dated her first, and then she'd broken up with him and started seeing Kevin, which caused a rift, obviously. But Kevin had made a few new friends at school, and his best friend would become Don Henry. Don lived in a trailer with his older sister Gayla, his father Curtis, who worked at the Little Rock Electric Company, and his stepmother Marvell, who was a registered nurse at the Saline County Memorial Hospital. Don and his father Curtis had started, bumping heads as Don grew older and became a teenager and started exercising his independence and autonomy, but the two had always had and still did have a very close relationship, and they spent most of their weekends together doing outdoor stuff like hunting and fishing. Both Kevin and Don were about to enter their senior year of high school, and they had spent the summer hanging out together, usually going on double dates with their girlfriends, but also focusing on their own ambitions and future plans. Kevin had been working as a bag boy at the Safeway store in Bryant, but this had mainly been a means to an end, a way to get money in order to repair and maintain his prized possession, a 1981 baby blue Camaro. Over the summer, Kevin had started working as a carpenter's apprentice, and his parents were very proud to see how responsible he had become, waking up every morning very early so he could leave the house by 5:30 a.m., wearing the leather tool belt his father Larry had given him as a present. Kevin had always been physically active and took care of himself. He worked out, he played football, and he earned himself a set of broad shoulders and muscular arms. So this job was appealing to him because he enjoyed working with his hands and he enjoyed being outside. I actually read a cute story about Kevin where when he started working out and he got more muscular in his arms, his little nieces would always run up to him at family events and they'd be like, "Show us your arms, Kevin," and he'd flex for them and stuff, and they'd be like, "Ah," and then they fall all over themselves. It's adorable. So Kevin's friend Don had also started a new job over the summer. He was working with his father, Curtis Henry, at the Little Rock Electric Company, which had made him eager to pursue a career as an electrician after high school. On the evening of Saturday, August 22nd, 1987, Kevin called home around 9 p.m. and talked to his mother, Linda, asking her if he could spend the night at Don's. Now, Linda's initial reaction was to tell her son no. Not only did she not know Don or his family well, because remember, Kevin and Don had only been friends for about 6 months, but the last time that Kevin had spent the night at Don's, he'd gone MIA, and Don's father, Curtis, had called her the following day wanting to know if the boys were with her or at her house. Linda and Larry Ives had worried for hours. They had driven around town looking for their son, but later that day, Kevin strolled into his house acting surprised that his parents had been so concerned and that his father had missed work to look for him, and he felt really guilty about it. He told his parents that Don and his father Curtis had been fighting, and so he and Don had gone and spent the night at the home of another friend. Now, Kevin apologized to his parents for worrying them. Don and Curtis made up, and then life went on as usual. But Linda was still hesitant to allow another sleepover. Kevin told her, relax, ease up, He said he was calling her from a payphone on Geyer Springs Road. He and Don were just cruising around with some friends and everything would be fine. Linda eventually gave in, but not before calling Don's father, Curtis Henry, and making him promise to have the boys home safe by midnight. Curtis said that he would, and he said that if Kevin and Don didn't get back in time, he would call Linda and let her know. Now, as far as we know, the boys had a pretty normal evening. They had dropped by to see Don's sister Gayla, who was spending the night with a friend. They'd shot pool at the local arcade, and they'd driven around with a friend near the old swimming hole, a popular teen hangout. The friend confirmed that both boys had left around midnight to get home, and Curtis Henry said that he remembered Don coming into his bedroom around 12:15 a.m. While Kevin waited outside on the front porch, Don asked his father if it would be okay if he and Kevin left the house again to do some late-night spotlight hunting. Now, spotlight hunting is a form of night hunting, and I'm not a hunter. I don't want to say I don't agree with it because I know people do it and I don't want to judge anybody, but personally for me, I would never do it. I think it's cruel and inhumane, and spotlight hunting is sort of even more cruel and inhumane than regular hunting because it happens at night. You usually need two people for it. One person shines a light in the eyes of the animal, which kind of like dazes it, distracts it, and then the other person takes their shot. It seems unsportsmanlike, to say the least. So spotlight hunting at that time was highly illegal in Arkansas, but it was also a pretty popular pastime for the Bryant youth. I mean, they're in the middle of nowhere, basically. They've got a few stores. There's really not much to do. And most of these kids grew up hunting all their lives. Now, Curtis Henry talked to his son Don for about 15 minutes and gave permission for this impromptu hunting trip. He would later say that he knew his son was a better and safer hunter than most of the grown men he knew, and Don and Kevin would be going to their normal place for spotlight hunting, the woods near the railroad tracks, about a mile away from the Henrys' mobile home. This was the same area that Don had hunted in with his father since he was a kid, and Don knew to stay out of sight in case one of the railroad men on a passing train spotted him and then used the train walkie to call in and report the illegal activity. So Don and Kevin left with Don's gun and Curtis's flashlight, and Curtis went back to bed. 3 hours later, around 4 a.m., in the early morning hours of August 23rd, a 6,000-pound Union Pacific Railroad cargo train coming from Texarkana passed through Bryant on its way to Little Rock. In the 1980s, Union Pacific was primarily focused on freight transportation, which made up the majority of its operations in Arkansas and nationwide. But Arkansas was a significant transportation hub due to its location in the center of the country, and Union Pacific played a key role in transporting goods through the state. The railroad also employed several people locally, including Larry Ives, Kevin's father, who had actually been the engineer on the exact route that this specific cargo train was taking, just until the month prior. So keep in mind that if this incident had happened a month prior, it would have been Larry Ives on that locomotive. But on this night, there was 3 men on the train: the conductor, Jerry Tomlin, an engineer, Stephen Schroyer, and Denny Delamar, who was the brakeman. Only 3 people responsible for a 75-car, over a mile-long train going down the track at a steady 55 miles per hour. The 3-man crew and their train passed over Bryant Hill and the Shobe Road crossing, heading toward a small trestle over Crooked Creek, which I guess wasn't so much a creek as kind of maybe what happens when you get out of the shower and you forget to put a mat or a towel down, and then you make like a puddle of water on the floor that you forget is there, and then you slip on it later. It was basically like all dried up, and there was just like a small trickle. It wasn't really a creek. Like I said, more of just like a trickle in the dirt. So as they approached this area, all 3 men spotted what looked like a dark spot on the rail ahead of them. Later, Danny Delamar would say, quote, "One headlight was on the bright position, and I noticed down the rail in front of me, some 10 or 15 cars away, there was a dark spot on the rail. I looked hard at it, and towards the last, I stood up to see what it was." End quote. All 3 men stood together to look, focused on that dark spot, trying to figure out what it could possibly be. Now, of course, they weren't automatically thinking that the spot was a body, or two bodies, but any obstruction on the rails was a reason to be concerned. Eventually, but too late, they realized what the dark spot was, and it wasn't one body, but it was two bodies laying side by side on the rails. Danny Delamar said, quote, "When we were approximately 100 feet away from this dark spot, Engineer Schroyer yelled out, 'Oh my God!' He hit the whistle and the emergency brakes at the same time. We could tell there were two young men lying between the rails just north of the bridge, and we also saw there was a gun beyond the boy who was lying to the north. There was something covering these boys from their waist to just below their knees, and I'm not sure what this object was. They were both in between the rails, heads up against the west rail, and their feet were over the east rail. Both were right beside each other, and their arms and heads were to their sides, heads facing straight up. I never noticed any movement at all," end quote. Delamar's recollection and description would be shared by his coworkers. Conductor Jerry Tomlin said the two boys were lying side by side like soldiers at attention. A dark-haired boy to the south was closest to the oncoming train and wearing a blue shirt, and a boy with lighter hair, who was shirtless, lay next to him. Tomlin also claimed to have seen the boys covered up to their waists with a pale green tarp, or something that looked like a boat cover. He said it looked like they'd laid down to take a nap and pulled the tarp over themselves like a blanket. Tomlin also clearly remembered that neither boy moved at all as the train approached, and between them lay a rifle. The rifle was laying flat on the ground, the barrel near the boys' heads, and the stock tucked under the tarp, or cover. Stephen Schroyer also saw the tarp, which he described as a piece of faded, well-worn green material that he said was, quote, "laying out on the boys, and it looked like it had been blown back, partly exposing them," end quote. Schroyer said that as they blared the whistle of the train and got closer, the two boys didn't even flinch. They were totally relaxed. He said, quote, "That's the thing that caught my thoughts, was how completely relaxed they were. And the thing that caused me so much problem afterward was that they didn't flinch, didn't jerk, didn't move at all, either one of them, with all of it happening, all that noise, all of it coming down on them," end quote. At that point, the stunned train crew had only about 5 seconds to respond and react, and anyone who understands velocity and speed calculations when it comes to enormous trains will know this is not enough time. Although the emergency brake was thrown and the horn was blaring, the two figures on the tracks still did not move as the train bared down on them, and the train wasn't able to slow down enough to miss them. Conductor Jerry Tomlin remembered the moment of impact, saying, quote, "We could hear them hit. You can hear it even when you hit a dog. It's mostly a thud, and then you can hear some rocks flying, because if what you hit is still under the train, you're scooting it along," end quote. Stephen Schroyer was absolutely traumatized by this, saying later, quote, "Your immediate thought is, my God, please get out of the way, and you can't stop. You can't stop a train that fast, and it's a hopeless feeling. If willpower could have anything to do with it, that train would have stopped. We would not have run over those boys," end quote. Now, according to the book Boys on the Tracks by author Mara Levitt, when a train hits an object on the tracks, one of two things usually happens. Either the scoop on the front of the engine, which is commonly called the cowcatcher, will toss the object violently aside, or the object will be sucked up under the engines, tumbled around a while, and then tossed out. By the time the object is ejected, the struck object has picked up the speed of the train. When the train finally slowed to a stop, Schroyer stayed with the radio, trying to get help to the scene, while Tomlin and Delamar grabbed flashlights so they could investigate and see exactly what they were dealing with. Now, obviously, when the train hit these two bodies, even though it was trying to stop, it still went another couple 100 feet. So they had to walk back along the train and along the tracks, and about 35 cars back, the two men started to see the first body parts. 3 dismembered toes. Those were the first body parts they saw. And for a quarter mile along the track, they found the chest and the head of the second boy, the lighter-haired boy who had been shirtless. It was a horrific scene, to say the least. However, Jerry Tomlin, who'd grown up hunting in Arkansas all his life, noticed something immediately about the blood. He said, even with all of those wounds, body parts being dismembered, there was very little blood, and the color of it was off. He said, quote, "We had reached the bodies within 10 minutes after impact. You would think that if the heart had been pumping when we ran over the boys, then the blood would have naturally flowed out, but it wasn't flowing. There was hardly any blood spilled at all, and the color of it bothered me too. It was night, and we couldn't tell for sure, but the blood we saw was not red. Not as red as you would think blood would be on a fresh kill like that. It was dark, more of a purplish color," end quote. All the guys on this train kind of felt the same. They don't have to be growing up to be hunters to notice that something is off, because they work on a train, and unfortunately, trains, because they can't stop if something's on the tracks, they're hitting stuff all the time. That's why there's something on the front of the train called the cow catcher, because sometimes there's animals on the tracks. Dogs, cows, what have you, deer. And so these people who are, making the train go and making it work, they're going to constantly be hitting live animals on the tracks. And they're going to know what it looks like when something is freshly killed. And what they're describing here is that the blood, it wasn't red, like oxygenated blood, which means the heart was pumping, putting oxygen into the blood. It was purple, more dark purple, darker, like older blood that had not been oxygenated in a while. 13 minutes after the train crew called the incident in, law enforcement arrived to the scene. They got there around 4:40 a.m. Deputy Chuck Talent and the head of the department's Criminal Investigation Division of the Saline County Sheriff's Office, Lieutenant Ray Richmond, responded. Now, Talent began mapping out the scene, including where specific body parts had been recovered. And right off the bat, everything got messed up because Talent, intentionally or otherwise, chose to use the corner of one of the train cars as a reference point as he was mapping out the diagram, so that when this train was finally given the all clear to leave later, the diagram of where everything was located immediately became useless. Jerry Tomlin and the rest of the train crew were not at all impressed with the initial investigation. Even they knew that something seemed off right from the get. Jerry Tomlin said, quote, "I'm just an old country boy. I was born at night, but I wasn't born last night. And I can tell you, I didn't think too much of their investigation. The deputy's attitude was more like, let's get this cleaned up and get back to the coffee shop." I don't know. People don't realize what a mess it was. Maybe they were in shock. Maybe they had weak stomachs. Maybe they just didn't want to face it. Whatever it was, I sensed all along that they were not out there looking for clues. End quote. The train crew told the police everything they knew and everything they had seen. They told them that the entire time they had not seen the bodies move once. They said that neither of the boys had reacted, not even at the very last moment. It's not just the sound of the horn that would make these boys react. It's the feel of the train on the tracks. The train tracks are going to vibrate. If you're laying on them, you're going to feel that. But even with this very odd information, the Saline County Sheriff's Office still seemed to be treating the incident as an accident, and they said that they believed the boys had been alive until the train had hit them. Not long after, the Arkansas State Police arrived, and Trooper Wayne Lanehart took in the scene and also later reported that something did not seem right. His training had taught him that any unnatural death should be treated in the investigation process as a possible homicide so that evidence could be preserved. And part of what was bothering him was the sheriff's office apparent disinterest in the possibility of foul play. They were behaving as if the collision was a definite accident. Unfortunately, the sheriff's office did have jurisdiction of the scene at that time because where the accident or the incident happened, it was technically an unincorporated area. So Lanehart kind of had to let them do their own thing, but he did give his opinion to them. And he was like, "I don't think these deaths look accidental." And they were like, "Thanks for your input, but we think it's an accident and we're going to just proceed that way." Now, EMTs at the scene, there's two of them that we're going to focus on, Billy Heath and Shirley Raper. They also noticed that they felt something was off about the scene. Billy would later talk to the state police about his initial impressions. And the state police report said, quote, "Mr. Heath stated the bodies looked more like mannequins, that there was very little blood at the scene, and that the blood at the impact site was very dark. Mr. Heath stated the blood was just too dark for him to consider normal. Mr. Heath stated he did not see any bright blood and that, in his opinion, there should have been some fresh blood at the scene." End quote. Shirley Raper told the police something very similar. She said, quote, "We grabbed our paramedics equipment and took off down the tracks. Billy reached the first body and he told me to stop and not come any closer. I just observed the one body, and it occurred to me right off that it was strange because of the lack of blood and the color of the body parts and the color of the blood. The body parts had a pale color to them, like someone that had been dead for some time." End quote. The EMTs also attached something called a note of interest to the reports. And this note of interest said, quote, "Blood from the bodies and the body parts we observed was a dark color in nature. Due to our training, this would indicate a lack of oxygen present in the blood and could pose a question as to how long the victims had been dead." End quote. So we had all these people coming in here, people who have, expertise in this. We've got state police, Wayne Lanehart. We've got the EMTs, Shirley and Billy, who this is what they do. Every day they go to scenes of, accidents and homicides and things like that. And you've got all these people saying, hey, there's something off about this scene. There's something off about the blood specifically. You even have the engineers saying, hey, this blood doesn't look like, fresh blood. It doesn't look like these boys were alive when we hit them. But the police officers, Talent and Richmond, continued on with their vein of investigation, which supposed that both boys had been alive on the tracks until impact with that train. The train crew also told the police about the green tarp that they had seen covering the boys as they approached. But strangely, the investigators seemed to believe that this tarp did not exist. They insisted that the crew had never seen it and that it must have been an optical illusion. They also didn't believe that the crew had seen a gun between the two bodies. Now, according to Jerry Tomlin, he walked the investigator down the tracks so that he could show them that the tarp and the gun existed. And Tomlin said, quote, "We all saw the tarp. They were definitely covered up from their waist down to their feet with it. But he told us it must have been an optical illusion, just like the gun. When he first arrived and we told him there'd been a gun, he acted like he didn't know what we were talking about. Then, when we were walking along the tracks, the deputies asked me where the alleged gun was. We had to take them and show them where it was. We'd found that too." End quote. Tomlin said that he walked the tracks and with a flashlight, he showed Deputy Chuck Talent where that green tarp was. He said that he saw it. It was like they were on top of a bridge and the tarp was, kind of like below the bridge, and he shined a flashlight on it and he was like, "There's the tarp that you said was an optical illusion." But Chuck Talent later denied that this had happened. Jerry Tomlin said, quote, "He denied that later. He said, I didn't tell him about finding the tarp, but I did, and I told him where part of it was, at the bridge bulkhead. I remember it as well as I remember him. I'm pretty observant. I catch most stuff. I remember seeing that tarp as well as I remember how Talent was dressed that morning. He had on a navy blue or black ball cap that said Saline County Deputy. He was wearing cowboy boots and blue jeans. He had on a black belt buckle that also said Saline County Sheriff's Office. He had a package of cigarettes rolled up in his shirt sleeves like a sailor going on leave, and he had his pistol, an automatic, stuck in the back of his pants like Magnum PI." End quote. I love Jerry Tomlin's description, by the way, because I see Deputy Chuck Talent in my head perfectly now, from the cowboy boots to the cigarettes rolled up in his shirt sleeves. Perfect. So Tomlin's colleagues, Delamar and Schroyer, they both reported remember Tomlin saying out loud to the police that he had located the tarp post the train collision incident, but no tarp was ever recovered or admitted into evidence. However, law enforcement did take a shattered .22 caliber rifle into evidence. Now, the sheriff of Saline County, James Steed, never even went to the scene, but later he would report that his deputies had searched the area thoroughly after the train crew had, called them and then described the tarp and what they were looking for. But he said, no, we never found a tarp. They never found a tarp. They searched this area thoroughly and completely. And in reference to Sheriff James Steed, his absence at the crime scene was strange, even to the local people, because he had a very strong reputation for being hands-on. Steed was the youngest sheriff ever elected in Saline County, and at the time of this incident, he was serving his 5th two-year term. He was also the son of a previous sheriff. Now, James Steed would later claim that he had not responded to the scene of this crime because his people had told him what they had and what it looked like, so he didn't feel the need to. We're going to talk more about Sheriff James Steed later. Trust me. So there was another police officer on site. That was Deputy Kathy Carty. She confronted her colleagues, mainly Chuck Talent, because she had not only observed the scene, but she'd questioned the train crew and the EMTs. And she told Richmond and Talent that she believed there was a chance the victims had been killed and then placed on the tracks. And she was a little upset when they told her and the other police officers there on site, like, basically, don't listen to Kathy. Shut up, Kathy. We're just going to treat this as a traffic fatality. Kathy Carty later said, quote, "I told the coroner, we either have two of the damnedest suicides I've ever seen here or we have a double homicide," end quote. And so the case went on as a traffic fatality. And since in Arkansas, accidents don't require autopsies, the bodies were initially sent to the funeral homes. Within hours, however, Chuck Talent would seemingly change his mind, and then he had the bodies sent to the state crime lab, where apparently at that time in Arkansas, all sorts of crazy stuff was happening at the state crime lab. We're going to talk about it. The state crime lab was located in Little Rock, Arkansas. We're going to talk about it. So at around 4 a.m., Curtis Henry, he woke up and noticed that his son Don was not home yet, even though Don's Firebird and Kevin's Camaro were still parked outside. An hour later, Curtis woke up his wife, Marvell, and he told her that the boys weren't home and he was going to go look for them. Curtis got in his own car and started driving towards the place that he knew that Don would hunt at night. It wasn't far from the Henry home, and on Shobe Road near the tracks, Curtis passed a deputy sheriff. So Curtis stopped the car, and he's like, "Hey, I'm looking for my son and his friend, have you seen two teenage boys? Do you know anything about two teenage boys?" And Curtis Henry said that the deputy was acting strangely, and the deputy asked him some questions, but never once mentioned finding the bodies of two teenage boys on the train tracks just about an hour before that. So Curtis Henry continued driving around, but when he had not located Don or Kevin by 10 a.m., he returned home and he called Kevin's mother, Linda, who, remember, she was already not super comfortable with having her son have another sleepover at the Henry house. She'd gotten a call from Curtis Henry the last time this happened, and now she was getting another call. And Curtis Henry asked her the same thing he'd asked her the last time. "Hey, are the boys with you?" And she was like, "Dude, I thought they were with you. Are we doing this again? What the hell's going on here?" And Curtis Henry was like, "No, don't worry." He reassured her. He said, "It's probably nothing. They went out hunting the night before. I'm sure they're fine." Curtis Henry said he was going to call Don's sister Gayla to see if she'd seen them or if they were with her. "Everything's going to be fine. Don't worry. I'll call you back." 2 hours later, around noon, Curtis Henry did call Linda Ives back, but his tone was completely different. He was not positive or reassuring, as he told Linda that their sons had been involved in an incident which had led to them being hit by a train. Well, actually, Curtis Henry said, "Somebody tied our sons to the tracks and shot them." That was what Curtis Henry told Linda Ives. And this is going to come back into play throughout this series, so just put a pin in it and bear with me. Obviously, Linda immediately went over to the Henry home where Deputy Chuck Talent was waiting to speak to her. Now, at that time, the parents of Don Henry and Kevin Ives were informed that it was believed the two bodies in the train tracks were their sons, but a positive ID wouldn't be made until the following day. 2 days later, Chief Deputy Rick Elmendorf of the Saline County Sheriff's Office gave a statement to local media saying, quote, "We are trying to come up with any feasible reason for something like this to happen. We haven't ruled out anything except foul play," end quote. Officially, what had happened was ruled as an accident, with law enforcement claiming they would need to wait for the state medical examiner, Dr. Fahmy Malik, to perform the autopsies and decide what the ultimate cause and manner of death was for these two teenage boys. Elmendorf also told the papers that the results of the lab tests had already come back negative for alcohol, and Sheriff James Steed said that if the test came back negative for drugs as well, they would redouble their efforts to determine what had happened here. But Steed also said that M.E. Malik's initial report showed the boys had been alive when they'd been run over by the train, stating confidently that there was, quote, "no indication of foul play," end quote. Privately, Elmendorf and Chuck Talent told the family members that Dr. Malik was leaning towards a self-inflicted death as the manner of death. And they also informed Kevin's parents that they'd found 1.9 grams of marijuana in his pocket. And Linda Ives did know that a few summers prior, Kevin had been caught smoking weed with a friend. But it still didn't make sense that one thing would be connected to the other. Why would weed in Kevin's pocket mean that he decided to lay down on the train tracks along with his best friend, and then they both decided at the same time to take their own lives? It doesn't make any sense. A friend of both the boys would tell Linda, quote, "Mrs. Ives, Kevin and Don did smoke a little dope. A lot of us did. But you don't kill yourself when you get high," end quote. Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate statement. So we're going to talk about Dr. Fahmy Malik because he is the most infuriating character in this case. And it's going to be very hard to believe that he had an honest bone in his body after we go through how he handled this case, as well as many other cases. So, Dr. Fahmy Malik had been educated at Cairo University. He arrived in the United States in 1970, at which point he did his residency in pathology at South Bend, Indiana, before working as an assistant coroner in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he received training in forensic pathology. Malik also worked for the ME's office in Chicago, where he was an assistant. In 1978, Malik moved to Arkansas, where he took a job in the state crime lab. That same year, some changes were made to the ME's office. So prior to 1978, the ME's office had been a part of the pathology department at the University of Arkansas for medical sciences. But in 1978, it was incorporated into the crime lab, which was placed under the new Department of Public Safety. Malik would only be at the ME's office in Arkansas for a year before he was given a huge promotion to State Chief Medical Examiner. And this was a position that had previously been held by Dr. Stephen Marks, who retired under the pressure of an investigation by the Department of Public Safety, whose director claimed that Marks was suspected of burning internal organs after the completion of his autopsies. It was rumored that he also allowed field agents to rule on the manner of death in numerous cases. The decision was made by the crime lab director, Clay White, to promote Malik, even though at that time Malik had not passed his boards in any branch of pathology. In 1979, a new statute in Arkansas specified that Malik's position could only be held by a doctor who was either board certified or at least eligible to take the board exams. And Malik was eligible, but it took him several tries before he became a board-certified forensic pathologist in 1985. So for 10 years, Malik acted as he wished with no oversight because at that time there was no policy, procedure, or group of individuals that existed that would sort of check to make sure that MEs were doing their jobs and behaving in the proper way. Very soon after taking over the ME's office, Malik gained a reputation for being odd, and not really someone you would want to cross. A former field investigator in the ME's office spoke out against Malik under a fake name because he was afraid of retribution. Apparently, Malik was kind of powerful and could pull some strings. This person who used the name Douglas said, quote, "Malik plays all these mind games. He could make it so miserable on you that you'd do what he said. He'd isolate you or ignore you. He has such control, he gets you afraid." End quote. Douglas also said that Malik's employees at the ME's office were forbidden from fraternizing with employees of the crime lab, even though both entities shared a building in Little Rock. Douglas said, quote, "Malik's reasoning was that he thought these people were possibly out to be against him. His crew might give out information he didn't want them to have. Malik never told anybody not to associate with anybody else. It was just known." End quote. Over the course of 12 years, Malik employed at least 10 different assistants, and a former field investigator for the ME's office, Jesse Chandler, said that it was basically a private joke amongst he and his colleagues. Jesse would have a running bet going with other employees of the crime lab that each new assistant under Malik would not last more than 6 months. Another former investigator, who also wanted to remain anonymous, said that it was believed Malik would hire assistants with questionable backgrounds or credentials. That way, quote, "when something comes up, he can blame it on them." A lot of them realized what Malik was and left in a few months. Malik always gets people to do his dirty work. End quote. Oh, there was also one of the investigators said that Malik would keep stationery on his desk from previous medical examiners, so it would be somebody else's name on there, and he would use that stationery to sort of go back in and modify or edit or make changes to previously done autopsies. So it would look like the changes and modifications had been made under a different person, but it was him doing it. So Mike Vowell, a former photographer for the crime lab, said, quote, "If you're not at his feet, you're at his throat," end quote. Basically, that means that Malik felt if you weren't, his friend, his ally, and had blind loyalty to him, you were a threat. If you're not with me, you're against me, kind of thing. So reportedly, Malik was obsessed with power and control. And the former investigator, Jesse Chandler, said, quote, "Malik cared more about power and prestige than money. He never took money from a prosecutor or threw a case for money. He wanted people to praise him and say, 'Oh, Dr. Malik.' He reveled in that so much. He loved people loving him," end quote. A former colleague of Malik's from Chicago described the doctor as being extremely paranoid. He called him a very sick man. So this was Dr. Lee Beamer. He had moved to Little Rock with his wife, partly because he and Malik had been friends and colleagues and Malik wanted him there. But Dr. Fahmy Malik soon began to make his old friends feel uncomfortable. And Dr. Beamer's wife, Nicole Beamer, said, quote, "He called us every night. He wanted to know what we were doing, what we were eating. He wants to control you completely," end quote. So the theme of Malik being incredibly odd and paranoid comes up multiple times, no matter who's recalling stories about him and their interactions with him. This individual, Dr. Larry Godfrey, met Malik in 1985 at a medical convention, and he said at that time, Malik told him he was looking for an assistant. But he thought it was odd because Malik said he was specifically looking for someone who was not board certified or eligible in forensic pathology. So a few years later, in 1988, Godfrey traveled to Little Rock to apply for a job in the ME's office. And at that time, he was certified in forensic, anatomic, and clinical pathology. He was very qualified and equipped for the job. But he said that Dr. Malik was not happy to see him there. Quote, "He seemed to be very paranoid. He seemed to be concerned that I was there to get a job and force him out of his position," end quote. So it seems like Malik wants people around him who are yes men, who are weak-minded, and who aren't that bright, or at least aren't as qualified as he was, so that basically he never felt threatened that anyone was going to push him out. And I'm going to be honest with you, Dr. Malik, not super bright or qualified either. In my opinion, allegedly don't come for me, but many people reported that everyone who visited Malik's office would have their picture taken by him, and he'd have a calendar hanging in the background to show like the date of when this picture happened. And this is actually something that Don and Kevin's parents, the Henrys and the Iveses, experienced firsthand. All four parents went to the Arkansas State Police headquarters in Little Rock to talk to Dr. Fahmy Malik upon the completion of their sons' autopsies. And at that time, he took Polaroids of them, and he had them sign forms acknowledging that they were there meeting with him on that specific date. And then he went over his conclusions and determinations from the autopsies. Malik told them that he had concluded that their sons, Don and Kevin, had both died from accidental THC intoxication. And his summary in his report said, quote, "At 4:25 a.m. on August 23rd, 1987, Larry Kevin Ives and Don George Henry were unconscious and in deep sleep on the railroad tracks under the psychedelic influence of THC, marijuana, when a train passed over them, causing their accidental death," end quote. Although Dr. Malik could not tell the parents how much the boys would have had to have ingested in order to be that high, that you would just go into like a coma on the railroad tracks and not hear or feel a train coming your way, Deputy Rick Ellendorf told Linda Ives that it was equivalent to about 20 joints. And he claimed that he'd gotten this number and this information from Dr. Malik, who would later deny ever saying that. So basically, Dr. Malik and Rick Ellendorf were telling the parents that their sons, Don and Kevin, had each smoked 20 joints and then just went into a coma on the tracks. It was Dr. Fahmy Malik's belief that Don and Kevin had smoked a bunch of weed and fallen asleep on the train tracks because that seems like a completely normal and natural place to rest and take a little nap. And they were so high and in such a coma-like state from that marijuana that they didn't hear the train coming. They didn't feel the train coming, and they didn't move at all as the enormous locomotive sped towards them. Now, this is interesting because prior to this meeting, deputies Elmendorf and Talent had told the Iveses and the Henrys that they'd found out Don and Kevin had purchased $10 worth of weed that night, which is obviously not enough to smoke them into such a stupor. I mean, I don't know any amount of weed that would cause that kind of coma-like sleep, but I digress. So this was a small town where everyone knows everyone and everyone talks about everyone's business, and Linda and Larry Ives had already started to hear rumors that the train crew, as well as the EMTs who arrived on the scene, had made notes of certain things about the crime scene that didn't add up, such as the lack of blood and the appearance of the blood that was there. The four parents decided to hire a private investigator, Ray Love, to investigate further because they felt something was not adding up and they were kind of being misled. They felt that law enforcement wasn't being completely upfront, and they just didn't buy the official narrative. They didn't buy the story that the Saline County Sheriff's Office and Dr. Fahmy Malik were telling them. So Ray Love agreed with the parents that something was off here, and he told the Arkansas Democrat, quote, "It was just done so neatly. I mean, it just seemed too coordinated the way the boys were both lying side by side with the gun placed between them. If a person's high, from what I found out, they're not going to be that coordinated," end quote. Ray Love would go on to talk to over 100 people, some involved in the case, others just medical experts and, people who were at the top of their field. And he said, quote, "No one I've talked to had bought the story that the boys were unconscious from marijuana. From the very beginning, it's been a bunch of dead-end roads. With no evidence of foul play, it just puts you right back where you started," end quote. But Linda Ives had a friend who worked at Saline Memorial Hospital, and this is the same hospital that had dispatched the EMTs to the train tracks that August morning. And this friend acknowledged that it was kind of a well-known fact throughout the hospital that the responding EMTs doubted that Kevin and Don had been alive when the train hit them. This friend also arranged a meeting between Linda and one of the EMTs, Billy Heath, and Billy, I guess, agreed to talk with Linda in the EMT office at the hospital. So this was at night. Linda arrives, and she walks up to the EMT office, Billy standing outside in the hallway, and he's circled by 3 Saline County Sheriff's deputies. And all of a sudden, even though he was willing to talk to her before, Billy had no interest in talking with Linda anymore. He was like, I can't talk to you. Linda's friend at the hospital said that the presence of the 3 deputies was strange, all on its own. She said she'd never seen 3 of them all at once at the hospital, especially not after 9 p.m. when nothing was going on there that would require their presence. Linda said that Billy Heath seemed nervous and he was stammering, and he told her that he couldn't talk to her, but he said, I spent 5 hours writing a report about this, and you should get that report, and you should read it. So as Linda was leaving the hospital, she claimed Billy Heath caught up with her, and he told her, hey, listen, I didn't know Don and Kevin's names at the time. They hadn't been identified. So in my report, I described them as the large boy and the small boy. I just want to let you know that, so you know kind of what I'm talking about and who I'm talking about. And then Linda left without ever really thoroughly speaking to either of these EMTs about what they saw and what they felt about the crime scene. So Ray Love, the PI, he gave the parents directions to obtain a court order so that they could get the records and the reports related to their son's deaths, and they could read Billy Heath's report. They did get the court order, but when Ray Love arrived to Saline Memorial Hospital to gather the reports, he was told that no EMT reports from that night existed. Now, since Billy Heath had told Linda Ives personally that he'd spent 5 hours writing a report, she knew this wasn't true. She knew that at least one EMT report existed, so they continued to put pressure on the hospital to materialize this report, which they eventually did in October of 1987. The parents were given a report from the ambulance call from the tracks, but it was not written by Billy Heath. It was Shirley Raper's report, and in it, she said the blood at the tracks looked as if it lacked oxygen, and this caused her to question the official time of death. The Iveses and the Henrys also questioned deputies Talent and Elmendorf about the green tarp that they knew the train crew had reported seeing, right? Because now they have the reports. They see that the train crew said, those 3 men who were operating the train, we all saw this green tarp covering these boys from their waist to their feet. But the parents were told that there was no way the boys had been covered by any tarp because the state crime lab had tested their clothes and there were no microscopic fibers that would have come from such a tarp. So this is just the beginning of the horrible travesty that Kevin and Don's parents would be put through for years. Nothing about the situation sat right with them from the beginning, and they continued to fight, even when many attempts were made to silence them, especially Kevin's mother, Linda Ives. About 3 weeks after the deaths, the parents tried to get a second opinion from a doctor in Memphis, Tennessee. His name was J.T. Francisco, and his rate was $200 an hour. And this is in the 80s, okay? $200 an hour in the 80s. Now, this guy actually supervised the autopsy of Elvis Presley in 1977, and 9 years before that, he had personally performed the autopsy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So you'd think he'd be pretty thorough, he'd be pretty good at his job, right? That's an assumption we're making here. So Dr. Francisco gave Linda Ives specific instructions on how he wanted the blood and urine samples preserved and then shipped to him. And the state crime lab in Arkansas agreed to pack and preserve and send these samples to Dr. Francisco in Memphis. But the state crime lab, they claimed that there was no urine sample for Don because his bladder had been completely destroyed during the train collision. Now, weeks later, Dr. Francisco called the parents. Remember, he's charging them $200 an hour. And he was like, yeah, I don't see anything wrong with Dr. Malik's ruling. You know, it's all good here. I agree with everything he said. And they're like, oh, damn, that sucks. But then they received the written results, and it showed that Dr. Francisco had only tested urine, and he had not tested blood at all. And he had written that Kevin's urine had 97 micrograms per milliliter of THC in it, which is fine. But then he also wrote that Don's urine showed 122 micrograms per milliliter, which you'd have to wonder, how did he come up with these numbers? Because there was no urine for Don sent to Dr. Francisco because Don's bladder was gone. What the hell? And why'd he ask for blood if he wasn't going to test it, right? So they get the written results. The parents called Dr. Francisco. They're like, what the hell is this, man? And he admitted that he actually couldn't quantify the amount of THC in either urine sample and that he had not retested the blood samples at all. And when he was asked how he could confirm Dr. Malik's findings without doing any testing, Francisco said he was able to confirm them using inference because he, quote, knew the tests at the Arkansas State Crime Lab followed standard procedures, end quote. Dude, you are here to give a second opinion, which means you do all the same testing so that you can give a second opinion. You don't just say like, yeah, I know they got it over there in Arkansas. They know what they're doing. I'm going to charge you $200 an hour and then blindly agree with everything Dr. Fahmy Malik says. That's crazy. Oh, but Dr. Francisco also confirmed to Linda Ives that he had personally spoken to Dr. Malik before coming up with his findings. And that's crazy. Once again, you're there to give a second opinion. That means you probably shouldn't be all, having cute, cozy conversations on the phone with the person who gave the first opinion that the parents clearly don't agree with, and they're paying you $200 an hour to come up with your own conclusions. So yeah, Dr. Francisco ended up not charging the parents because apparently he's something of a con artist and he got caught. Allegedly, just my opinion, don't come from me, but we may have to revisit the cases of Elvis and MLK because this is some shady shit, all right? This is some really shady shit to do to the parents of victims, to do to these parents who just lost their teenage sons. It's real bad. It's real bad. So by Thanksgiving, according to the Saline County Sheriff's Office, the case was officially closed. But Don and Kevin's parents, they hadn't accepted this. With all the trouble they'd been getting with the runarounds and the changing information, they were more motivated than ever to get to the bottom of it. They wanted to send Dr. Malik's autopsy report to 2 different pathologists who had done extensive research and work with marijuana and who were considered experts in that field. Now, Linda Ives contacted the crime lab again to get more samples sent into these pathologists, but Dr. Fahmy Malik, in all his paranoid glory, told them no. He said if they wanted samples, they should get a court order. Now, they did in fact get this court order, but when the PI presented it to Malik, the medical examiner still refused to provide the samples. He just said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm Dr. Fahmy Malik. I'm going to take a Polaroid picture of you, and then I'm not going to give you what you want. Linda Ives called the state attorney general's office to let them know that Dr. Malik was flat out not cooperating with a court order, and she was stunned when she was told by a deputy attorney general that he couldn't force Malik to comply. This guy was like, I'll talk to him. I'll ask him if he wants to cooperate, but I can't make him do anything. So having exhausted their legal attempts to get answers, the parents turned to the media. On February 8th, 1988, Linda and Larry Ives stood next to Curtis and Marvell Henry in front of reporters at the Otter Creek Holiday Inn, and they detailed their issues with the investigation and with Dr. Malik's ruling. And Linda spoke out about how all of the people who were supposed to help them had blocked them at every turn, especially Dr. Malik. The parents said they believed their sons had been murdered, and Curtis Henry said, quote, "No one has assured us that marijuana will put you in a position to be unconscious. In fact, everything we have read or learned about says no, it won't," end quote. The following day, Dr. Malik magically changed his tune. As people do, as corrupt people do when the media gets involved. And he became the picture of cooperation as he met with Larry Ives and Curtis Henry in the company of several reporters, of course, for a photo op. Dr. Malik was the picture of compassion and cooperation as reporters snapped pictures of him sitting with the fathers of the two victims. And Dr. Malik said, I'll release the samples. But I believe wholeheartedly a new investigation is not going to reveal a different cause of death. We get it, dude. We get it. You have an ego. We don't have to talk anymore. Dr. Malik also offered to have Kevin and Don's bodies exhumed if the parents wanted another autopsy done. And he said, quote, "If it were my son, I would exhume the body and hire the best medical examiner in America. I am a father, too. My son is a teenager. I have 2 kids. But this is the bottom line. Those 2 children died because they were hit by a train." End quote. The Arkansas Gazette printed that Malik urged the fathers 3 times during their conversation to have another autopsy done by a pathologist of their choosing. But he added that the organ tissue had been preserved in formaldehyde, so it would be useless in toxicology tests. When the reporters and the cameras cleared out and Malik was left alone with Larry and Curtis, his scare tactics and his paranoid craziness resumed. From the book Boys on the Tracks by Mara Levitt, quote, "As they sat, an assistant brought in several jars. Malik unscrewed the lid of one. The room filled with the stench of formaldehyde. Malik took a pencil, moved it past the mouth of the jar, and touched an item inside. 'That's part of your son's heart,' he told Curtis. 'And what is that?' Curtis asked, pointing to something else in another jar. Malik became angry and quickly resealed the jar he had opened. Curtis recognized the move as another of Malik's threatening techniques, like trying to show the parents the autopsy photos, aimed at dissuading them from pursuing their inquiry." End quote. This Dr. Malik is such a dick. By the way, I'm just going to put it out there. He's a dick. I cannot believe the audacity of this man. So in front of reporters, Malik's urging the family members of these 2 boys to pursue their own investigation. Yes, get the best pathologist in America. I would do it if it was my sons. But when all the eyes were removed and there was no more photographers there to snap pictures and tell Dr. Malik how amazing he was, Dr. Malik told Curtis Henry and Larry Ives that it was pointless to send samples somewhere else to be tested. And he told them they were just going to waste their money hiring quacks. It takes one to know one. So Dr. Fahmy Malik made it clear that he was going to now cooperate, but out of the goodness of his heart. Not because he had to, right? He made that clear too. He was like, I'm going to cooperate because I'm a good person, but I don't have to, just so you know. Saline County Sheriff James Steed echoed this sentiment, making a statement after the press conference that he was satisfied with the investigation conducted by his department, and he announced that he had total confidence in Dr. Malik. He said, quote, "There was nothing at the scene of the accident that was visible that would make anyone think it was a homicide. That's the reason we do an autopsy. If there were injuries that were not consistent with being run over by a train, these should have been detected by Dr. Malik, and I have complete confidence in him," end quote. You want to phone a friend, dude? You want to really rethink this statement. Complete confidence in him? In Dr. Fahmy Malik? Sheriff Steed told the press and the public that at this time the case was inactive, but not officially closed. Now, this blatant and audacious bullshit caused Linda Ives to pen a letter to Sheriff Steed on February 9th, 1989, the day after the press conference, and she let him have it. Oh, it was an open letter, by the way, which means everybody saw it. The letter said, quote, "Sheriff Steed, you have stated that you are satisfied with the investigation your department has conducted in the death of my son, Kevin Ives, and his friend, Don Henry. You have also insinuated that our dissatisfaction with the investigation stems from the personal tragedy that we have suffered. I would like to point out to you, as well as the public, some of the reasons that we are dissatisfied. 1, it is a fact that the area was never roped off as a protected crime scene. 2, this area could not possibly have been searched thoroughly for evidence of a crime. After the investigation of the scene was completed, family and friends went to the area and found Kevin's foot, the gun stock, and other parts of the gun Don had, and other personal belongings of the boys. I consider this clear evidence of how well the area was searched. 3, we were informed about reports that 2 people had heard gunshots shortly before the accident. Saline County Sheriff's Office assured us that tests would be done on the gun Don carried, but tests were never done. 4, we were assured from the very beginning that SCSO, which is the Saline County Sheriff's Office, would request assistance from the state police. Colonel Goodwin informed me that a request was never received in his office. It is a fact that there is no state police report of any kind filed on the accident. 5, 3 train crew members reported a green tarp partially covering the boys as they lay on the tracks. One of the crew saw where it landed and shined a light on it and informed SCSO where it was. SCSO, Saline County Sheriff's Office, assured us that they would personally interview the train crew rather than rely on the railroad investigator's report. That never happened either. They now tell us that the green tarp was an optical illusion. It's magic. 6, there was information given to SCSO that could have developed into a possible lead, but that informant was never contacted. 7, Don's mother found a partial bag of marijuana in Don's jeans pocket on 2/5/88, nearly 6 months after Don's personal effects were returned to her. A SCSO deputy said they turned the boys' clothes inside out, but somehow they missed the bag of marijuana, evidence, and contraband. What else was missed besides a foot and marijuana? 8, the back of the train was used as a reference point for gathering evidence, so when the train pulled away, the reference point was lost forever. These are just a few things regarding the SCSO's investigation that we are unhappy over. Some things we know about. I shudder to think what we do not know about. And last of all, Sheriff Steed, you have no firsthand knowledge of this investigation that you are so proud of. You did not even bother to go down to the scene, nor have you ever contacted us personally regarding the deaths of our sons. End quote. And that's a mama bear right there. So when Linda Ives was referring to things being found after the Saline County Sheriff's Office had claimed to have conducted a thorough search, she's referring to a few different things. The day after Don and Kevin had been run over by the train, a relative of Don's had been walking the tracks and discovered a severed foot, at which point he then notified the sheriff's office. They sent a deputy to pick that foot up, and it was taken to the county coroner, who called the state crime lab. But officials there informed the coroner that the autopsies were already done and the bodies had been sent to the funeral homes. The coroner then called the funeral home, where Kevin's body was, and a courier was sent to pick up the foot so that it could be buried with Kevin. No one knew about this for months. And remember, early on in the investigation, when the parents had gone to Little Rock to meet with Dr. Malik, well, at that time, they'd been introduced to a Lieutenant Frank Mitchell of the Arkansas State Police. And they were really happy about his presence there because they'd been requesting that the sheriff's office bring the state police in to help, right? The state police have more resources. They have more knowledge with this kind of stuff. The sheriff's office never did that, but the parents wanted them to. So a few buddies of Larry Ives had also been walking the tracks, and they had discovered a large piece of cardboard that had a stain on it, and the stain looked as if it could have been blood. So Larry Ives told Mitchell from the state police that he believed the piece of cardboard was big enough to have been used to drag a body or more than one body, and Larry Ives was like, maybe somebody used this cardboard to drag Kevin and Don's bodies to the train tracks where they were left for the train to run over them. And so Mitchell from the state police, allegedly, he took this piece of cardboard, right? And he was like, I'm going to get it to the medical examiner. I'm going to get it to the crime lab for testing. Don't you worry about it. Don't worry about it, Mr. Ives. Mitchell also took a few other items that Curtis Henry's friends and relatives had found by the tracks, which were a few pieces from Don's gun. Strangely enough, the cardboard was never seen again after that day. The crime lab would later report that they'd never examined any cardboard. They'd never even seen any gun pieces. So during all of this, Linda Ives received a phone call from someone called Richard Garrett. He was a district deputy prosecuting attorney. He was running for re-election that year, and he'd claimed that until he'd seen the press conference, he had no idea that the parents of the boys on the tracks were dissatisfied with the way the investigation had been handled. Garrett said he was interested in trying to help them, and he wanted to hold something called a prosecutor's hearing to re-examine the case. Apparently, this kind of hearing is very unusual. It's rare. It's kind of like a grand jury, but unlike a grand jury, the findings would not be kept private. They wouldn't be sealed from the public. The public would be able to know what happened during this prosecutor's hearing. Garrett claimed that if new evidence was uncovered during this hearing, he would be able to set aside Dr. Fahmy Malik's ruling and then submit the case for an actual grand jury. So the four parents took a meeting with Garrett along with another man named Dan Harmon, who was Garrett's law partner and friend. Now, I know we're talking about a lot of people. There's a lot of information, a lot of facts coming to you. Just know that I'm not going to tell you about people or bring people up if they're not going to play an important role in this case. Later on, I can't say exactly when because I don't want to give too much away, but they will come back. So we have Dan Harmon, who had some previous experience as a special prosecutor in front of grand juries, and Garrett felt that Harmon's expertise and advice could be invaluable. So together, they put forth a list of 33 witnesses that they wanted to be subpoenaed, including Dr. Fahmy Malik and the two EMTs, Shirley Raper and Billy Heath. The prosecutor's hearing was scheduled to start on February 18th, 1988, but 2 days before this, the parents were summoned to Dan Harmon's office where they met Sheriff James Steed face-to-face for the first time. Harmon sat them down. He was like, listen, I know you don't like this guy, but Steed wants what we all want. You know, we want a good investigation to be done. We want to find out what happened to these boys. And Sheriff Steed is willing to admit that some mistakes may have been made. Now, however, during this interaction, James Steed's demeanor and words did not sit well with Linda Ives and the other parents. He even went so far as to say that their criticism against himself and the sheriff's office had made law enforcement's job more difficult. However, Steed told Linda Ives and the others that he would bring in the state police and he would take another look at the case if they would stop publicly criticizing him. He was up for re-election that year after all, and this was not helping his campaign. So another press conference was scheduled so that the parents of the boys and law enforcement could show their new united front. And a pre-written statement was handed to Linda Ives to read in front of the media. The statement is as follows, quote, "The problems we have encountered in the investigation of our son's deaths have not been with the Saline County Sheriff's Department. The Sheriff's Department has been cooperative and helpful and devoted a great deal of man-hours to the investigation. It is unfortunate that the initial crime scene search did not uncover everything that it should have. However, the scene covered at least a half mile of railroad tracks and the surrounding woods and thickets. We have encountered problems getting the state crime lab to cooperate and felt that a court order was necessary to obtain information. The sheriff's office has never refused to cooperate. We are pleased that progress is presently being made in the investigation and want every possible lead followed and pursued and have no other comment at this time." End quote. So Linda Ives looks at this statement and she was like, oh, nope. She flat out refused to read these words. She was like, I will stand here silently while someone else reads this shit. But this statement, these words are not going to leave my mouth. Okay, I will not say this. So during the press conference, Sheriff James Steed announced that he would be bringing in the state police for help. And then Richard Garrett, he talked a little bit about an experiment that they had conducted the night before the press conference. So Garrett, along with Curtis Henry and Larry Ives, went to the railroad tracks where the boys had been found. And they did this about 20 minutes before a train was scheduled to come through there. And wearing thick insulated overalls, Garrett himself laid on the tracks in the way it had been described that Kevin and Don had been seen lying on the tracks. And Richard Garrett announced, quote, during the press conference, he said, quote, "It was very uncomfortable because of the rocks. The only way I could get comfortable was to move, to rest my head on the rail. I stayed on the track as long as I could. It was terrifying. I watched the train come. I heard it blow its whistle. I felt the rails shake. You could tell the train was coming from up to a mile away. I don't see how anyone could have slept through it. It scared the devil out of me." End quote. Garrett told the gathered reporters that in his opinion, he did not believe the boys' deaths were accidental, and he also said he didn't feel they could have even gotten comfortable enough on the tracks to fall asleep because they'd been wearing thin t-shirts, or I believe in Don's case, no shirt at all, and he'd been wearing padded overalls, and he was still very uncomfortable. Now later, Linda Ives would blast Sheriff James Steed publicly again, telling everyone about the deal he had made with her and the other parents and accusing him of not holding up his end of the bargain. Linda said, quote, It seems the publicity about the case was looking bad for him, so the deal was he would give us his cooperation in the investigation we had been begging for 6 months. All we had to do was issue a statement saying that we had no problems with him or his office, that the lack of help and cooperation we had been complaining about was strictly with the state crime lab. He in turn was to issue a statement saying that perhaps our case did warrant further investigation by his office, and they were going to take another look at it. He wanted us to make our statement immediately, but he wanted to wait until Dr. Malik had testified at the prosecutor's hearing on February 22nd, 1988, because it would look better. It didn't take any thought on our part to decide we could do anything and say anything it took to get the investigation that Kevin and Don deserved. So, on February 17th, 1988, we called a press conference and bit our tongues and lied for Sheriff Steed. We said we had no problems with the Saline County Sheriff's Office. Well, 14 months after the murder, 8 months after the deal, and 2 weeks before election, Sheriff Steed finally issued his statement. I'm beginning to understand a lot of things, but I will never forgive Sheriff Steed's actions and obstinate refusal to do anything in the long months since that time. End quote. Now, Linda Ives referenced a statement that Steed would make to a grand jury and to the media, confessing to making a little white lie and saying the investigation was over. He said it wasn't actually over, and he'd only lied because he wanted to continue to investigate out of the public eye. And Linda said that Sheriff Steed did lie when he'd said those words. And she said, quote, reporters are routinely given access to case files that are considered inactive or closed. I know for a fact that they were given this case file on many occasions to review, even long after the grand jury was in session, end quote. We are going to come back to Sheriff Steed and his involvement and impact on this case. But I want you to understand that there was a great deal of tension and animosity between the Iveses and the Henrys and Sheriff Steed along with the Saline County Sheriff's Office. They were not happy with each other. Now we're going to wrap up this episode, and next time we're going to talk about what happened during the prosecutor's hearing, which would eventually lead to the bodies of Don Henry and Kevin Ives to be exhumed so that second autopsies could be done. Autopsies that would reveal shocking details, which showed that Dr. Fahmy Malik either had no idea how to do his job or showed that he had outright lied about the cause of death for these two boys and that he was covering for someone. And during the prosecutor's hearing, Dr. Malik would go on to act like an absolute clown on the stand. He would lash out like a child when the testimony of actual experts countered every single thing he said. And not only that, but as he was made to look like a fool in the hearing about Kevin Ives and Don Henry, Malik would be called out for his ruling on 2 other cases. And he would be accused of overstepping the bounds of his authority in several cases. So we're going to talk about that next time. I know this was probably a long video. Thank you for hanging out with me. Let me know what you think about it in the comment section so far. I know there's a lot of you that might be familiar with this case and might be familiar with where this is going, but if you could possibly just not give any spoilers in the comments. Just give your thoughts on this part so far. And, I know that people always get worried that I'm not going to get all the details or I'm going to miss something, but I promise I will do my very best. And if at the end of it, you want to tell me what I missed, let me know. But otherwise, you can just wait for me to weave in the details where they need to be woven in. I would really appreciate that. I don't know what that was, but that was me weaving in the details into the cases and the stories. So thank you all so much for being here. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. Subscribe if you haven't already. And until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe. And I'll see you very, very soon. Bye.
Straight down.